and welcome to today's session, which is a virtual API Jam with Apigee Edge, with a focus on security. The first thing that I wanted you folks to do is to complete the prerequisite step of signing up for a free Apigee Edge account, a trial account. You should be able to sign up on the sign up page providing these details as is shown here. And hopefully once you've signed up and verified your account through email, you should be provisioned a eval organization on Apigee Edge. Once that's done, I want you to familiarize yourselves with the webinar tools. The first thing that I want you to note is that the resource list pop-up on the right as part of the webinar screen is not going to be used today, so please do not refer to that. Unfortunately, that has not yet been updated for today's webcast, and therefore the links may be wrong. So please don't use the resource list pop-up that's on your webinar screen. Once you've closed that, you should be able to use the other tools on your webinar screen, such as Q&A, which you will primarily use to ask your questions about the lab exercises. Please use Q&A to ask any individual questions that you may have regarding the lab exercises or today's session, or any other types of questions that you may have. The group chat button here is what you'll use to open up the group chat pop-up. And this is where the Apigee team, that's me and my colleagues on the call today, this is what we will use to post links for you to access the different lab exercises and other reference links. Therefore, it's sort of like a broadcast for the Apigee team to the registrants on today's webinar. So group chat is primarily for that. Last but not least, you use the media link here, or the media button here, to view the screen share. Hopefully you're able to see my screen and essentially the browser window that I'm showing you as of now. Once again, if you're seeing the resource list pop up on the right there, that is not something that you will use. Just a moment, folks, just confirming again that you are able to see my screen. Okay, awesome. I see that it's now loaded. So hopefully if you're seeing the resource list pop up on the right, please do not use that for today's session. You will only use the Q&A, as I mentioned before, to ask your questions. You'll use group chat for the links that we post for you to access the resources for today's session. And finally, just the media button there to open up my screen. Don't use the screen that says slides, the pop-up that says slides in your webinar, because that's essentially not what we'll be using for today's session. So make sure you're able to view my screen here with the mouse pointer moving around and the browser open. Awesome. So let's get started. Hopefully, if you've already signed up for a free Apigee Edge account, I want to cover again the high-level labs that we'll be walking through today. So as you know, the Apigee Edge API management platform provides different types of out-of-the-box security for your APIs. If you think of architecturally where the platform sits and what types of threats and security risks that Apigee Edge helps protect your APIs against, you can broadly classify them into the types that are shown on the screen here. So we help you protect your API traffic against network risks in terms of implementing two-way TLS and API security. We help protect your data privacy for whatever data that you do store on the platform, and for the transitional data that goes through the platform as your API requests are being handled. We are, all these standards compliant as such from a security perspective. We do provide access control policies, out-of-the-box policies that will help you authenticate and authorize the access to the APIs that you expose. And we also provide threat protection policies that help protect against traffic-based threats as well as content-based threats, right? So at a high level, what we'll be covering as part of today's lab is, for starters, we'll start by implementing threat protection for your APIs by using spike arrest policy and regular expression threat protection policies, where essentially, one, we are protecting your APIs against traffic-based threats and throttling them so that you don't experience denial of service attacks. And secondly, we are protecting your API request and response payload content against injection threats, right? And any type of manipulation threat for that matter, using regular expression threat protection. Secondly, the second lab that we'll cover is to do with actually the second and third labs that we'll cover today are to do with API level security, which is authorization and authentication for your API. We'll be using the out-of-the-box policies to implement OAuth 2.0, as well as JSON Web Tokens as a means of protecting your API endpoints. Last but not least, what we'll cover is how you can use Apigee Edge in tandem with a third-party identity management service like Okta to implement identity management for your end users, application end users, in addition to API authentication and authorization. Finally, we'll take a last couple of minutes, provided we have enough time, to cover Apigee's API security platform called Apigee Sense, which is essentially a platform that is meant to protect against behavioral threats that could attack your API surface, your API endpoint surface, such as distributed denial of service, any type of bot attacks, and other malicious user involved behavioral threats. So with that said, let's get started with Lab 1, where we are going to use what is called a spike arrest policy to protect against denial of service threats that hit your API endpoint. So before we get started, hopefully you've you've signed up for a free Apigee Edge account, and you are able to log in to apigee.com. So go ahead and use either Chrome or Firefox. Unfortunately, we don't support any other browsers, so make sure you're using Chrome or Firefox to log into apigee.com. So go to login.apigee.com and sign into the account that you just created through the trial process. So I'm going to go ahead and sign in here to show you how that works. So once you've signed in, you should be able to see the Apigee Edge Management UI, where you will have access to an org, which is a logical tenant on the platform to manage your APIs. And the org that you'll have access to will end with -eval, most likely. So make sure that you're not using personal space, but you switch to that particular org, wherein you'll be creating the assets for API management within the management UI. So once you've signed up and logged in, make sure that you also have access to the API Jam materials, which are basically the lab exercises and the guides for the lab exercises that you'll be accessing today. So we'll go ahead and post on the group chat of the webinar the link to these lab exercises. So hopefully you should have access now. My colleague Raj has posted the links to the lab exercises on the group chat. Go ahead and open that, and you should see a GitHub repository for Security Jam with the various labs that we'll be using today. So let's get started with Lab 1. So Lab 1 is about how to throttle your API traffic to prevent denial of service. And we're going to be using what is called a spike arrest policy. A quick note about the spike arrest policy before we get started. Essentially, the way that this policy works on Apigee Edge, if you're familiar with Apigee Edge, the way that we enforce API management policies is by configuring those policies on the request or response pipeline of what is called an API proxy, which is the configuration element within Apigee Edge. So we're going to use the spike arrest policy and apply that to an API proxy, which exposes an API endpoint. The way that the spike arrest policy works is, provided a time interval, it will smooth your API traffic that hits that API call, the API endpoint, across that time interval. So for instance, if you say that the number of API requests that are allowed to hit this API endpoint is 10 per second, then the way that the spike arrest policy works is within the matter of 1 second, it will allow 10 requests. Now, for instance, let's say that the amount that you want to allow will be 10 per minute. Then for every 6 seconds, only 1 request will be allowed. So basically, the traffic is smoothed across that time interval, which is a minute, to allow 10 requests in a uniform interval across 1 minute. So let's get started with Lab 1. Hopefully, you should all have access to the Lab 1. You can access it directly from the repo through the link here. We'll also be posting the link to Lab 1 on group chat for you to click directly and get access to the lab guide. So the way that we'll conduct today's sessions is I'm going to give you the next 15 minutes to go ahead and read through the lab guide and complete Lab 1. Please post any questions that you may have on Q&A so that my colleagues or I can get to it. And after the 15 minutes after you've completed Lab 1, I'll go ahead and explain to you what we'll be doing as part of Lab 2. So let's get started. So once again, folks, for those of you who joined late, we are currently in Lab 1, where we're going to see how to use the spike arrest policy within Apigee Edge to throttle the API traffic that hits your API endpoints. Folks, just a quick note, as part of working on this lab, essentially you'll be applying the spike arrest policy and then testing for a spike arrest violation. It's okay if you don't see a 500 and you see a 429 status code. I believe we might have made some changes on the status codes. As long as you're seeing an error message that says spike arrest violation, you're getting the same kind of results as is expected in the lab. All right, hopefully most of you have completed Lab 1. So just to recap, what we've done as part of Lab 1 is you should, by the end of Lab 1, have an API proxy that you've created called mock target API. And on this test API proxy, we've implemented what is called a spike arrest policy with 12 requests per minute as the throttling limit. And once you've tested it, you should be able to see the spike arrest violation occur as you're sending out the requests more than 12 requests per minute. So you should get a 429 or a 500 that states that a spike arrest violation has occurred. All right, so let's get started with Lab 2. So what we're going to do as part of Lab 2 is we are going to enforce content-based security, which is basically protecting the API request and response payload against content-based threats. These threats could be things like JSON or XML manipulation. It could also be threats such as any other type of API request or response content manipulation that affects the integrity of your API payload. Now, to prevent against that, Apigee Edge provides 3 types of out-of-the-box policies. So the types of out-of-the-box policies are JSON and XML threat protection policies and regular expression protection policies that will help you protect your payloads against things like SQL and JavaScript injection threats. So as part of today's lab, we're going to be implementing 2 of the policies, the first being the JSON threat protection policy, and secondly, the regular expression threat protection policy to protect against SQL injection threats. So without further ado, let's get started on Lab 2. I'm going to go ahead and post the link to Lab 2 in group chat so that you can access it directly. Folks, we're going to take the next around 15 minutes to complete Lab 2. Hopefully all of you are done with Lab 1 and you can see the Lab 2 link posted on group chat for you to be able to access the Lab 2 guide. And you should be able to walk through the Lab 2 exercise guide as is provided. There's also a link to Lab 2 at the end of Lab 1 and the end of the guide. So once you click that, it will take you to Lab 2, which is threat protection policies on Apigee Edge. So again, we are going to be using the JSON and regex threat protection policies today. Additionally, if you want some more information, you can also try out the XML threat protection policy. For now, please follow the lab guide and complete Lab 2, which is for threat protection. Folks, once again, I'm not going to be demoing these labs. I want you to be able to follow along the lab guide and complete these labs. In case you have any questions, please post it on Q&A so that myself or one of my colleagues will be able to respond to you. The idea is that you should be able to complete these labs yourselves. And if you run into any issues, please do let us know. Thanks. All right, to recap, what we did as part of Lab 2 was to our proxy, we added, for a post call, we added a JSON threat protection policy, which essentially protects against JSON injection threats. So as part of this policy, what we're doing is we're checking that the JSON payload that was sent to the API call only has 5 object entries, as opposed to any more. If it did have more than 5 object entries as part of the JSON payload, it's going to return an error saying only 5 allowed. Now, the other thing that we also added was a regular expression threat protection policy on the view IP address conditional flow, which is a GET call. And to this, what we're doing is we're making sure that if within a query param called query, there is a delete or drop or any other type of unallowed SQL query that is being sent, then it will return a error response stating that you cannot execute that particular query or that it's an invalid request. Now, to see this in action, you can go to Trace, start your Trace session, and you can either use the Apigee Edge REST client that's provided in the documentation, or you can use any type of terminal window on Mac. For instance, you can use curl to execute the API requests. So the first thing that we want to check is we want to hit the echo endpoint, which is a post call, and we want to send more than 5 request attributes as part of the JSON payload. So once we do this, you'll see that it says JSON threat protection execution failed, and therefore it's basically disallowing more than 6 attributes in this object. So you'll notice that it says object entry count at line 7, so which is basically the 6th one that is not allowed. So once I delete the 6th entry, 6th field in the JSON payload, and try to send again, you'll notice that it's executing successfully with the 200 response. Similarly, when we test out the SQL injection policy or the regular expression threat protection policy that we've set up, you're going to be hitting the /IP endpoint, which is basically a GET call, and you're going to be sending a query parameter with the value delete. Once we do that, you'll notice that it says regular expression threat protection policy executed, and then it'll say this is not allowed. If you try with something else like select in the query para, it should work. It'll just give you the IPs of the proxy endpoint. You can go back to your trace and see the successful and failure responses and see that the policy was triggered. Now, let's move on to lab number 3. If you've completed lab 1 and 2, let's move on to lab 3. What we're going to be doing as part of lab 3 is to protect your API endpoint with OAuth 2.0. Now, Apigee Edge has out-of-the-box functionality wherein it can act as the OAuth provider, which is to say that not only can it be the enforcement layer for authorization to access to your API, but it can also provide the tokens, the access tokens, and be the token endpoint in the process of OAuth to protect your API calls. What we're going to be doing as part of this lab is we are going to work on 2 proxies, 2 API proxies. The first proxy that will import, download from the lab guide and import is the token endpoint, which will generate access tokens to be provided at the time of API calls. And the second proxy is our existing API proxy, where we'll secure that API proxy with what is called an OAuth v2 policy that is provided on Apigee Edge, and configure it so that it verifies access token before further action is taken. So if you look at the types of OAuth grant types that Apigee supports, we support client credentials, resource owner password credentials, auth code, as well as implicit grant types. As part of this lab exercise, which is lab 3, what we're going to see is how to implement two-legged or client credentials-based OAuth flow. So we will import a OAuth token endpoint proxy into your org, and we'll also modify the existing API proxy to verify for client credential-based access token. So let's get started. I'm going to post the link to lab 3 on group chat. Please refer to that and refer to the lab guide. You can also refer to the lab guide by going to the end of lab 2 and clicking on the link provided there. Let me go ahead and post the link to lab 3 on group chat. So hopefully you should have access to the link to lab 3 on group chat. Just click that and follow the guide as specified for lab 3. So for this exercise, although it states 30 minutes, let's try and complete this within the next 15 to 20 minutes. Folks, a quick note on lab 1. Essentially, when you have to download the proxy token, the token endpoint API proxy, which is called OAuth, and import it into Apigee Edge, the proxy name, you might have to modify it because it's going to say that a token endpoint already exists. So if it does exist, please make sure to modify it to something like OAuth-1. And also, if there's already a proxy called OAuth in your org, make sure that it is undeployed. So the way that you would do that is you would go to the deploy button for that proxy, and if you already see it green on one of the environments, just click that again and it will undeploy. So make sure that the one that is deployed is the one that you're downloading through the lab guide. So once again, folks, you might already have a OAuth token endpoint as part of your eval org. So what I would suggest is go ahead and ensure that it's not deployed anywhere, that particular OAuth token endpoint. Instead, the one that should be deployed is the one that you download from the lab guide, which you can label as OAuth-1. And then you can go ahead and deploy it to the same environment where your API proxy is. All right, folks, hopefully you have all reached the end of lab 3. Essentially, what you should have at the end of lab 3 is you should have created an OAuth token endpoint or token proxy, which basically generates access tokens based on client credentials grant type. And you should also have modified your existing API proxy and protect it using the OAuth 2.0 policy so that for all valid API calls, an access token should also be provided. The way that you'll be testing this is you can either use the REST client that is mentioned in our lab guide, or you can use curl or any other terminal tools to generate the token endpoints as well as invoke the API call. I've used the REST client here, and you'll see that I'm sending a request to the token endpoint or the OAuth proxy with the appropriate client credentials that we generated by creating both API products, registering a developer, and creating an app. So you'll notice that once I created my app, I also get a valid set of client credentials associated with that app. Which is the consumer secret and consumer key. I've used those to be able to invoke the token endpoint. Make sure that you follow the format for the invocation that's provided in the lab guide. Once I do that, I get a valid access token that's being generated. And I'm using that access token to then invoke my mock target API, which is protected with a access token verification policy. You'll notice that if you were to remove this authorization header where the access token is being sent in the format bearer space access token, if you were to remove this, you'll notice that you get an invalid access token error. So hopefully all of you have reached the end of lab 3. You can access lab 4 by navigating to the end of the guide and selecting the link there. We'll also post the link on group chat in a minute. So let me post the link to lab 4, and then we'll go into a quick explanation of what we're doing as part of lab 4. All right. hopefully all of you should have access to the Lab 4 link on group chat. What we're going to be doing as part of Lab 4 is we are going to create a JSON Web Token generation endpoint on Apigee Edge. Now, Apigee has out-of-the-box support for JWT in the form of 3 different policies: the generate JWT policy, the verify JWT policy, and the decode JWT policy. Now, typically, you're going to want to generate JWT, which is a bunch of encrypted claims for access to a particular API resource. But you're typically going to want to invoke that only after authorizing the end user as well as the client application that is going to be consuming this particular API endpoint that is protected with a verify JWT policy, right? So, however, in this lab, what we're going to do is we're going to just see how to go about creating the endpoints for generation, verification, and decoding of a JWT policy. You can extend this applying the verify JWT policy to your existing mock API target after authorization using, let's say, verify API key or some sort of client credentials or end user authentication has occurred already. So for now, let's go ahead and walk through the steps of Lab 4, which will take you through how to create a JWT token endpoint. So for this lab, I'm going to provide the next 15 minutes. I think 10 minutes should be sufficient. However, let's provide 15 minutes for you to wrap up all other labs and then complete Lab 4 as well. All right, folks, hopefully you should be completing the Lab 4, which is how to generate a JWT token using Apigee Edge. What you would have completed is you would have imported a proxy called the JWT proxy, which includes the token generation endpoints and configuration using the JWT policies on Apigee Edge to generate a JWT token as well as to verify a JWT token. So once you've done that, and what you're going to do is you're going to use either the Apigee REST client that is provided as part of the documentation, or you're using any type of terminal-based client to invoke the post request to generate a token. So you should see a token being generated as is shown here. You can also test that that token includes the details that are provided by Apigee in terms of claims by decoding it. And to decode that, you can use any any open source utility that's provided, like the jwt.io browser-based tool. All right, so now that we've completed labs 1 through 4, let's go on to our last lab, which is Lab 5. So in order to access the Lab 5 guide, you can go to the end of Lab 4 guide and click on the link provided there. We'll also provide the link to Lab 5 by posting the link on group chat in your webcast window. So just give me a minute here, folks, while we post the link to Lab 5 in group chat. So what we're doing as part of Lab 5 is we are going to integrate the OAuth flow on Apigee Edge along with identity management protection. So what that means is we're going to integrate Apigee Edge with an identity management service like Okta to be able to validate app end user credentials in addition to generating the OAuth token on Apigee Edge through a password grant type flow. So the ways in which you can integrate with an identity management service, with Apigee are various. So the first option is where potentially you want to use something like an Okta for identity management purely, where it only validates end user credentials or app credentials. Typically, you might also want to use this in an SSO type of scenario where all your applications that access your APIs have have SSO enabled, so end users of those applications need to provide some sort of identity or identity credentials. You can also implement it through OpenID Connect, for instance. And then finally, Apigee will be used as the enforcement layer for API resource authorization. So you can either use Okta purely for identity management identity management, or you can use it for both identity management as well as OAuth, where potentially Okta can also be used as the authorization server that grants access to the API resource. So the scenario that we'll be seeing as part of Lab 5 is option 1 here, where Apigee serves as the authorization server as well as the token generation service, whereas Okta serves as the identity management service that protects and validates the end user credentials. So let's get started. We'll provide all of the resources that are indicated here as part of the references as part of Lab 5. So let's get started with Lab 5. The link to the guide should be available in group chat in your webcast window. Please go ahead and go through these detailed steps provided as part of Lab 5. All right, folks, hopefully you have reached the end of Lab 5. Essentially, what we've done as part of this lab is we've imported in a proxy endpoint for the OAuth token generation based on integration with Okta. So if you look at that proxy, what's happening within it is it first calls out to Okta to validate user credentials, end user credentials, before generating the access token using Apigee. Even before you imported in this proxy, what you would have done is you would have created a end user profile with credentials on Okta. And the way that you could do that on the shared Okta instance that we provide is by invoking the Okta create user API. Hopefully you've provided something like this with your own first name, last name, email ID, and so on. And you would have received a response that states that an active user has been created on Okta, end user for your application. The second thing that you would have done, which you should have already completed as part of Lab 3, was to have created a product that packages the mock target API, as well as create an application that subscribes to that product and generate, using Apigee Edge, generate client credentials from that application. So once you get a hold of those client credentials, the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to also, again, this should have been completed as part of Lab 3 because it's the same policy config, but you should have secured your mock target API proxy with a verify access token policy, which is basically the OAuth v2 policy with verify access token operation. So you should also have this. So once this has been set up, you're going to test this out by invoking the token endpoint, which is the newly created token endpoint, by providing grant type password, the user being the email ID of the user that you newly created on Okta, the password that you provided at the time of user creation, the client ID and client secret that were generated by Apigee when the app was created, and then finally, when you send the request with headers, accept, and content type as stated here, you should get a valid access token. Now you can then use that access token to make a request to our mock target API. So hopefully you're seeing all of the results as stated here, and you've completed Lab 5. The very last thing that I want to cover as part of today's session is a brief overview of Apigee Sense. Now, what is Apigee Sense, right? If you think of all the out-of-the-box protection that Apigee Edge provides for APIs, there are other types of attacks that are much more intelligent in nature that you need to start protecting your API attack surface against. Now, to give you an example, there have been many organizations in the past that have faced these types of attacks that could be something like intelligent DDoS DDoS attacks, bot attacks, brute force attacks that try to scrape for different API keys and so on. It could be any type of dictionary type of attack. It could be a man-in-the-middle type of attack. Now, in order to protect yourself against these types of attacks, traditionally we have seen our customers try to implement something like a WAF. And it could be like a web application firewall or something like a content management system in between that helps protect at the network level against these types of attacks. Now, the disadvantage with this configuration is that it doesn't help protect against intelligent attacks where there is an intelligent party involved that basically tries different types of behaviors in the attack to basically compromise your API endpoint. Now, while a WAF would be able to help protect against specific regions or client IPs, you cannot necessarily protect against different behavioral patterns, or rather you cannot necessarily protect against intelligent attacks, which are detected only by watching the behavioral aspect of how that attack occurs. And so in order to do that, Apigee Edge provides Apigee Sense, which is an intelligent behavior detection platform and security platform for your API attack surface. So it is essentially purpose-built for these types of attacks where a behavior is involved and the detection of that behavior, that anomalous behavior is involved in detecting a particular type of intelligent attack. These could be things like bot attacks, brute force attacks, and so on. Now, how it works is it gathers metadata from your API runtime traffic, detects behavior, it processes that particular metadata for behavioral analysis, and this behavioral analysis can be defined on Apigee Sense through different rules that you can define. For instance, you can define a specific rule for bot detection, a specific rule for brute force attacks, for API key scraping, and things like that. And once you've defined those different types of rules on Apigee Sense, you can then go back to the Apigee Edge platform and enforce the detection of those rules and automatic action against those rules within Apigee Edge. The way that it works is essentially your client API calls will pass through Apigee Edge through the API proxies to hit your backend targets. And the way that Sense works is it will interact with Apigee Edge to gather information about your API data or your API analytics. Behaviorally analyze that API analytics based on the rules that you have provided in Sense. And then the rule could include things like actions that need to be performed on the API if a rule were to be triggered. And so that is also something that you define in Sense, and the action takes effect within the API proxy on Apigee Edge. So you can access Sense once you've gained a Sense license by going to sense.apigee.com. And let me give you a quick overview of what the dashboard looks like. Give me a moment here, folks, while I complete login. So this is what essentially the Sense screen looks like. You're able to view things like total traffic, total bot traffic, bot count, and so on in the summary view. You can also see over the last 7 days, last 30 days, etc. You can also go ahead and take a look at the rules that have been defined for this particular, for this particular organization. You'll see that there are multiple types of bot detection and whitelisting rules that have been defined. Within each of these rules, again, you can see what types of actions have been defined for those rules. So for instance, if there is a web attacker in the last 4 hours with a certain type of IP address, go ahead and block it. If you notice that there is a US-based IP address for something that lives, if there is a, let's say, China-based IP address for something that lives in the US, then you want to definitely block that particular IP, for instance. you can also take a look at how the detection is happening. So while we saw the protection rules, you can also take a look at how the behavioral analysis and the detection is happening. So there are out-of-the-box rules that Apigee provides, as well as custom rules that you can use. So for instance, you can take a look at the Flutter rule, which basically looks for different types of conditions for client and bot attacks that flood your API endpoints. You can also take a look at the things like the OAuth harvester that tries to harvest your OAuth access token. You can take a look at brute guesser, which tries to guess a valid API key. There are multiple such rules that you can essentially define. So this is what you've seen so far is essentially Apigee Sense. And you can obtain an Apigee Sense license over and above an Apigee Edge license, which is the API management license. So that brings us to the end of our session, folks. Hopefully the labs that you've gone through were useful to you. We would love it if you could provide some feedback. This is essentially the first time that we're conducting a virtual API Jam for our security labs. So please go ahead and access this URL. We'll post it on group chat momentarily. Please access this URL and provide your feedback on how the labs were today and how we can improve this particular session. All right, folks, that brings us to the end of our webcast. We're going to stay on for a couple more minutes to make sure that we answer any unanswered questions that you might have posted on Q&A. But hope this was fun for you folks and you were able to learn a lot through our Security API Jam labs. And see you again next after 2 weeks. That's the frequency we're thinking of holding these labs. As also, apart from filling the feedback form, just one more note, we will be sending you follow-up emails with a recording of the session as well as links to the labs. Thank you all for attending. We're going to go ahead and close the webinar now.